Nowhere was the air war more closely tied to surface combat than in the South Pacific. There savagely fought land and sea battles, both determined air superiority and were determined by it.
The destruction of the U.S. battleships at Pearl Harbor forced the abandonment of all preconceived U.S. notions of conducting a war with Japan. The Carrier Task Force came into being by default. The United States was determined to strike at Japan. The untried aircraft carrier was the only tool available. Large American carriers, such as the Yorktown and the Enterprise, could carry 80 aircraft deep within enemy waters. There they could fence with their Japanese counterparts, like the Shokaku and the Zikaku. Each of them could carry 72 planes. Carrier task forces could do effective work. They could peck at the periphery of an enemy's defenses, as the U.S. Navy had pounded Japanese outposts in the Marshall Islands. But all naval authorities were sobered by the fate of the British ships Prince of Wales and Repulse. The battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse were sunk by Japanese bombers and torpedo planes in the attack on Malaya and Singapore. This is a Japanese reconstruction of that battle. Ships were no longer safe from air attack. As a result, the use of carriers within the range of long-distance land-based air power was considered too dangerous. Carriers were at their best when engaged in battle with each other.
Unlike the U.S. Navy, the Japanese had built up a well-equipped land-based naval air force. Its aircraft were suitable for operating over long distances. They included the G4M Betty and the A6M Zero. In 1941, the Zero had a range that was not achieved by the North American Mustang until 1944. Japanese strategy in 1942 was not concerned with defense. It depended on obtaining great results from small numbers of aircraft that could fly long distances and inflict crucial damage.
The Pacific War was characterized by sharply divided opinions on how it was to be conducted. There were even greater rivalries among its fighting forces. The rivalries existed at the very top, between Roosevelt and Churchill.
We expect to eliminate the danger from Japan, but it would serve us ill if we accomplished that and found...
Roosevelt's inclination, and that of his commanders, was to meet the pledge to relieve Russia by establishing a second front. This would be achieved by an invasion of France, followed by a thrust to the German heartland.
The peace that follows.
Churchill and his commanders feared a land war against the Germans. They preferred other options that ranged from Norway to North Africa to Italy. The British wanted to fight anywhere on the periphery that would weaken Germany, not kill too many British soldiers, and perhaps fulfill the pledge to Stalin of a second front. There were disagreements within Roosevelt's staff. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, didn't like the British. He wanted to throw the Japanese out of Alaska and then out of the Pacific. On this, he was backed by General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had survived the defeat in the Philippines to become an American hero. King and MacArthur were overruled by General George Marshall, General Hap Arnold, and others. Europe was to come before the Pacific. The majority of Allied men and materiel were to be devoted to the defeat of Hitler. A much smaller amount was given to the containment of the Japanese. King and MacArthur had their orders. but they also knew how to play the system. Neither man could be forced to serve under the other, so neither could be given command of the entire Pacific theater. In July 1942, MacArthur was made Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific. King's representative, Admiral Chester Nimitz, would command the rest of the Pacific. It was an awkward split, ill-defined geographically and in terms of forces. There was confusion about the control of amphibious operations, air power, and supplies. Admiral Nimitz was assigned Operation Watchtower to capture the Santa Cruz Islands in preparation for an attack on Tulagi in the Solomons. At the same time, MacArthur was to drive the Japanese out of New Guinea. Then MacArthur was to invade New Britain and seize the main Japanese base at Rabaul.
The Japanese armed forces were split along traditional Army-Navy lines. Each service wanted a different strategy. Neither was willing to cooperate with the other at command levels. Japan was having problems with its conquered territory in East Asia. It now had direct access to supplies of iron ore and petroleum. But a growing shortage of shipping was making it difficult to transport these raw materials to Japan. Army and Navy agreed that the conquered territory should be maintained and the shipping protected, but they disagreed on how to do it. The Army wanted to bring all of New Guinea under its control and threaten Australia. The Navy wanted to defend the Solomon and Bismarck Islands. The Army prevailed. The Japanese began a determined drive over the Owen-Stanley Ranges to take Port Moresby.
At the same time, the U.S. Navy discovered that the Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. On maps, the island chains running from Malaya to the Fijis seem strung together by stepping stones, but in fact, they stretch out over enormous distances of water.
Japan's opening thrust had reached the Solomon Islands. The Solomons has thousands of harbors that could serve as havens for small ships, flying boats, barges, and submarines. Japan had adopted colonial military tactics. It had established strong points all along the chain of islands. In doing so, it spread its army, navy, and land-based naval air forces to the point of indefensibility.
MacArthur's headquarters were in Australia. He was determined to return to the Philippines by driving the Japanese out of New Guinea and New Britain. Nimitz wanted to take the Central Pacific route, through Micronesia, capturing the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and the Carolines. MacArthur's and Nimitz's offensives would support each other. They would keep the Japanese from concentrating on just one. The carrier forces could be rapidly switched from one to another.
The battle on Guadalcanal began on an even basis. The island had never figured in either Japanese or American preliminary planning. The fight began accidentally, but then took on a life of its own.
The island of Guadalcanal was considered uninhabitable by the white plantation owners of the area. It is about 100 miles long and 30 miles across. Guadalcanal was owned by the British for more than 100 years. On May 5, 1942, it was seized by the Japanese. On August 7th, the Allies totally surprised the Japanese. They brought a 76-ship invading force to take Tulagi, Tanambago, Gavutu, and Guadalcanal Islands with overwhelming force. Nimitz had dispatched 3 of the Navy's 4 remaining aircraft carriers, the Saratoga, the Enterprise, and the Wasp, to provide air cover for the landings. But Guadalcanal was not secure. Possession of the airfield would hang in the balance for months. Marines established a perimeter around the airfield and began searching out the remaining Japanese. Their efforts would be frustrated by continual Japanese reinforcements. Guadalcanal was slowly transforming itself into a meat grinder for men, planes, and ships.
The Japanese Naval Air Force reacted swiftly. The first of many attacks was launched from Rabaul. 27 Bettys and 18 Zeros took off. So did 9 Aichi D3A Vals. But their mission was to be one way. They did not have the range for the round trip. The attack was typical of the Japanese air war methods. A relatively small number of aircraft flown by highly skilled crews. Their mission, to make a precision strike against what they hoped was an ill-prepared enemy defense.
In fact, the defense on Guadalcanal was relatively well prepared. This was partly thanks to the still primitive radar sets, but mostly it was thanks to one of the most unusual intelligence-gathering groups in history, the Coast Watchers. The Australian Navy had recruited planters, natives, retired servicemen, and others to hide out on the small islands and broadcast Japanese naval and air activity as they observed it. The Coast Watchers were small in number, highly intelligent, and subject to certain death if captured. On August 7th, the Coast Watchers warned the U.S. carriers of the inbound bombing raid. Tough Grumman F-4F Wildcats repulsed the onslaught. The dogfight signaled just how ferocious the air war over Guadalcanal was going to be. The Japanese lost 13 out of 54 aircraft. The Americans lost 9 out of 44. These losses diminished the Japanese Naval Air Force's appetite for battle. They gave the Americans time to dig in. A second attack the following day was also beaten off. 18 Japanese aircraft were shot down. But in response to the threat of land-based air supremacy, the U.S. carrier force pulled out. The Marines were left without air cover.
Some historians have called Admiral Fletcher's decision to withdraw his carriers desertion. But he was aware that his were the only carriers available. To lose them would have been catastrophic.
The Marines used primitive Japanese construction equipment to turn the Japanese airstrip into Henderson Field. On August 20th, the first aircraft of what came to be known as the Cactus Air Force arrived on Guadalcanal. 19 Grumman F-4Fs and 12 Douglas SPDs from the Marines were followed by the 1st Army Air Forces unit, 5 clapped-out Bell P-400s, the export version of the P-39 Air Cobra. The P-400 was a very modern-looking aircraft with a tricycle landing gear, a 20-millimeter cannon in the nose, and the engine mounted behind the pilot. It was unable to handle the Zero in air-to-air combat, but it excelled in bombing and strafing duties. This small force would be whittled down almost to extinction. The pilots flew continuously. It was soon evident that 30 days was about the maximum time that could be endured, given the stress of combat and the unhealthy living conditions. Pilot proficiency and confidence was growing. Major John Smith and Captain Marion Carl vied to become the top ace over Guadalcanal. Carl was the first to 5 victories. Then the two men ran neck and neck for weeks. Then, when they were tied with 12 each, Carl was shot down. After 5 days in the jungle, he got back to find that Smith had 16 victories. Carl suggested that Smith be grounded for 5 days to give him a chance to catch up.
The Japanese army misinterpreted the departure of the carriers from Guadalcanal. They assumed that the troops on the island had been abandoned and were disorganized and demoralized. They sent a 1,000-man invasion force. It was led by the arrogant Colonel Kiano Ichiki. He proudly radioed notice of his success as he marched to a comprehensive defeat. His force was trapped by the 1st Marine Regiment. His men were slaughtered, and he committed harakiri.
It was a significant win, the first clear-cut victory by American troops over the Japanese army. It dispelled the idea that the Japanese were invincible jungle fighters.
The Japanese would consistently underestimate the number and fighting power of the Americans. They used ancient maps and devised complex battle plans requiring split-second coordination between Army, Navy, and Air Forces. Belatedly, Admiral Yamamoto began to realize that it would take a full-blown combined operation to retrieve Guadalcanal. He mobilized his combined fleet and 11th Air Fleet. He ordered the Navy to ferry in troops on destroyers, known as the Tokyo Express. Land-based air power ruled the seas around Guadalcanal during the day. Admiral Tanaka, commanding officer of the destroyers, demonstrated how a single leader can make a difference. His cruisers would leave Bougainville in the early afternoon. They would steam at 30 knots and arrive off Guadalcanal about midnight. They would drop troops and supplies overboard, fire on Henderson Field and other targets, and speed away. Yamamoto once again showed his liking for the complex approach. He divided his force into many small commands. The fleet, under Admiral Nagumo, consisted of 2 large carriers, a light carrier, 3 battleships, 9 cruisers, 13 destroyers, and 36 submarines. A fleet carrier force sailed the waters north of the Solomon Islands. It consisted of 2 carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, 2 battleships, and 2 cruisers. A smaller force under Admiral Hara Chuichi included the light carrier Ryujo.
It was seen east of Bougainville by a U.S. Navy Catalina patrol plane. Fletcher took the bait. He sent 30 Dauntlesses and 8 Avengers against the Ryoju. It was caught by torpedoes from the Avengers. After 7 hours of drifting, it sank.
Admiral Nagumo ordered the counterattack from his 2 carriers. 2 waves totaling about 60 aircraft were sent into the towering cumulus clouds covering the American fleet, straight into the guns of 50 Grumman F-4Fs on combat air patrol. But the Japanese aircraft broke through and damaged the Enterprise.
The battle was inconclusive, but it served notice on the Japanese that the resupply of Guadalcanal was going to be bitterly contested.
Henderson Field was now a 3,800-foot strip. 1,000 feet were covered by pierced steel planking known as Marston mat. The 1st Marine Division was dug in around the field perimeter. From the field center, it was only 2.5 miles to the enemy in any direction. The pilots fought and slept in the same clothes. They lived on potatoes, canned hash, and Japanese rice. The pilots flew mission after mission. American offensive flights began soon after dawn. Marine SBDs and Army Bell P-400s bombed and strafed. Daily combat action for most of the fighters began about 11:30 and lasted until dark. Coast watchers would report the approach of Japanese Betty bombers. Radar would pick them up about 125 miles out. This gave the Grummans ample time to get to altitude. They would cruise about 5,000 feet above the Bettys. They looked for opportunities for a direct overhead pass or a high side attack, avoiding defensive fire from the Betty's 20mm tail cannon. The almost awesome respect for Japanese fighters like the Zero and the Oscar began to fade. After months of close encounters, it was apparent that one F-4F could not dogfight with a Zero, but two F-4Fs, working together using the Thatch weave, could handle 4 or 5. The move was named after Jimmy Thatch, a 7-victory ace. It called for a pair of Wildcats to fly in a widespread formation. When a Zero attacked, the Wildcats banked toward each other. If the Zero followed his target, it led him into the guns of the other Wildcat.
The Zeros were lightly built, skinned with thin duralumin. The pilot's seat was not armored. The 3 fuel tanks were not self-sealing. The Zero could only absorb a few seconds fire from the F-4Fs before exploding. But the tank-like Grummons could take an endless hammering from the Zeros. The Zero was faster, but could not follow the Wildcat into a turning dive. The Japanese Army and Navy remained at odds. The Army had not yet realized that there were now 17,000 Americans on Guadalcanal. It sent a force of only 5,000 men to retake the island.
In an attack called the Battle of Bloody Ridge, 600 Japanese were killed. 40 Marines died defending the position. 3 of the USAAF's much maligned Bell P-400s did a magnificent job strafing the enemy.
The Japanese were so confident of success that they left their food supplies behind. Half of the force died of starvation during a week-long trek back through the jungle. But Japanese submarines avenged this defeat on September 15th. They sank the Wasp and hauled the battleship North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien.
The Americans were more vulnerable than they had been since Pearl Harbor. There was only one carrier in the area, the Hornet. Aircraft from the damaged Saratoga had been ferried to Henderson Field.
As September ended, the battle balanced on the razor edge of minimum air power. Air power, in turn, depended upon the strength of the marine perimeter.
The Japanese High Command now decided that Guadalcanal must be taken at whatever cost. Henderson Field had to be captured and the defending air forces destroyed. The Japanese began to strip units from the forces fighting MacArthur's troops in New Guinea. They even set the date for the American surrender ceremony, October 21st. General Hyakutake Harukichi planned to use 2 infantry divisions to defeat the 7,500 Americans he estimated to be on the island. Japanese intelligence was wrong by 12,000 men. On October 13th, the Japanese unleashed 2 air attacks. They put the runway at Henderson Field out of action. They set fire to several aircraft on the ground and destroyed 5,000 gallons of precious gasoline.
The air attacks were just a prelude. At 0138, Japanese battleships began to shell the runway with their 14-inch guns. All gasoline supplies were destroyed. All the Avengers and most of the SBDs were destroyed. Most of the F-4Fs were okay, and 6 of the P-400s were left. The next night, there was more shelling. It destroyed almost everything missed in the first round.
Henderson Field was now impotent. The Japanese began unloading troops and supplies. The force was built to 20,000, including tanks and heavy artillery. But the Japanese now began to throw their advantage away by making a series of ill-coordinated frontal attacks on marine positions.
The terrifying Japanese banzai charges melted in the face of marine firepower. The Japanese were forced into another humiliating retreat through the jungle.
Now, Hyakutake called for 12,000 men to reinforce the 15,000 he had remaining. They were to be brought to Guadalcanal the following month in a great transport armada. In the meantime, the Japanese carriers sailed to sink the Hornet. They believed it was the only US carrier remaining in the area.
But the Hornet had been joined by the Enterprise. It was also reinforced by the new battleship South Dakota. On October 26th, the American carriers drew first blood in what would become known as the Battle of Santa Cruz. SBDs from the Enterprise sighted the Japanese light carrier Zuiho.
The SBDs dived on the Zuiho and blew a huge hole in the flight deck. It was unable to recover aircraft, but could still launch 9 Zeros for the next strike. Admiral Nagumo's strike force from the flagship carrier Shokaku was made up of 22 Vals and 18 Kate torpedo planes. They were escorted by 27 Zeros. Most of the pilots in this formidable force were veterans of Pearl Harbor. It was to be a bad day for the American fleet. The Japanese launched a well-coordinated attack on the Hornet. One of the dive bombers was damaged and crashed into the flight deck. More bombs and torpedoes set the Hornet afire. But even as the Hornet burned, her aircraft were attacking the Shokaku, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. 4 1,000-pound bombs hit her flight deck, putting her out of the war for 9 months. A second Japanese strike of 78 planes attacked the Enterprise and the South Dakota.
They hit the Enterprise 3 times and put a bomb into the South Dakota's No. 1 turret. Just as it appeared that the torpedo bombers had been driven off, 18 Vals dropped out of the sky on the Enterprise and the South Dakota. Eight of the Vals were shot down, but single hits were scored by the Japanese on the Enterprise, the South Dakota, and the San Juan. The battle was savage and intense. Damage control parties on the Enterprise showed the skill gained by experience. They were able to put her in a condition to begin recovering aircraft. The air was full of returning planes. Lieutenant Robin M. Lindsay was the landing signal officer. With incredible skill, he managed to land 95 aircraft on the Enterprise before a lack of deck area forced him to halt operations. 54 planes had to ditch in the ocean. The fires on the Hornet had almost been contained when another attack from the Zikaku's Kates forced her to be abandoned.
The Battle of Santa Cruz was a tactical victory for the Japanese. They had sunk the Hornet and sustained damage to only 2 of their carriers. The United States had entered the war with 7 carriers. 4 had been sunk by the Japanese. Now only 1 remained in the Pacific, the damaged Enterprise.
But the U.S. fleet was growing stronger every day. America was able to replace ships, planes, and pilots on a prodigious scale.
In contrast, the combined fleet was severely weakened. It had no immediate prospect of replenishment. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, its fighter and bomber crews, was being consumed in a fatal war of attrition.
Both navies' carrier task forces were weakened to the danger point. The principal air combat shifted back to land-based forces. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal had reached a low point of 30 fighters on October 26th, but now it was being steadily reinforced. By the end of October, it became possible for the first time to rotate pilots out for rest.
The Japanese High Command planned another major air, land, and sea attack on Guadalcanal for the middle of November 1942. Westerners assumed that the Japanese military was highly disciplined. But in fact, it tolerated insubordination to a degree unheard of in Allied armies. Junior officers often countermanded orders that were not radical enough. Senior officers feared being accused of cowardice or lack of patriotism. They did not dare resist. A Japanese colonel, Tsuji Masanobu, was one of the major practitioners of this insubordination. His arguments drove the Imperial Army into piecemeal commitment of its forces in Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal's fate was decided in the series of land, sea, and air battles that began on November 12, 1942. The odds in numbers of ships were very uneven. The Japanese had 2 carriers, 4 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, and 30 destroyers. The American Admiral Halsey could only muster 5 cruisers and 12 destroyers. Repairs were accelerated on the aircraft carrier Enterprise. It would sail from Noumea, New Caledonia on November 11th. It would be accompanied by 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese sent in heavy cruisers to bombard Henderson Field, but only a handful of aircraft were destroyed.
Admiral Tanaka had a fleet of 11 transports escorted by a dozen destroyers. He assumed that the cruiser attack had knocked out air power on Henderson Field. But shortly after noon, an American force made up of aircraft from Henderson Field and the Enterprise arrived in force. They systematically began to slaughter Tanaka's ships. 7 transports were sunk. Four were forced to beach themselves. The next day, they were shuttle-bombed by Avengers from Henderson Field. Troops struggling down rope ladders were killed. The supplies in the ships were burned. Of the 10,000 Japanese soldiers in the transports, only 4,000 made it to Guadalcanal, now called by the Japanese the Island of Death.
Admiral Halsey later correctly noted that until November 15, 1942, the enemy advanced at its will. From that point on, it retreated at the will of the Allies. Guadalcanal demonstrated that air, sea, and land power were no longer just complementary. They were inextricably intertwined.
The Japanese Prime Minister, General Tojo Hideki, ordered the evacuation of Guadalcanal on January 4, 1943.
It was also a signal to Japanese leaders that the United States was not going to seek a negotiated peace. Instead, it would bring the full weight of its enormous resources to bear. There would be many bitter battles after Guadalcanal, but none where the issue was in doubt. For the next 2 years, Japan, the nation that prided itself on never losing a war, would suffer one disaster after another. American strength would grow quickly. the United States would elect to fight the war on its own terms, substituting firepower for manpower on a scale undreamed of. In early 1943, American strength on Guadalcanal was growing rapidly. The battered 1st Marine Division had been relieved. The U.S. Army assumed the predominant ground fighting role. By early December, Henderson Field had almost 200 aircraft. There were 71 Wildcats and 17 of the new Lockheed P-38s. This beautiful new twin-engined fighter would prove to be perfectly suited to the Pacific theater. In many respects, after Guadalcanal, it was a totally new war. Over the next 3 years, America would vastly expand the land-based Army Air Forces. It would field fleets of new aircraft carriers and produce hundreds of thousands of aircraft. The majority of these new aircraft would be types not seen before in battle.
The Japanese would launch some new carriers as well. They would introduce new combat planes, but in pathetically small numbers. For the most part, the Japanese Army and Navy would fight the remainder of the war with updated versions of the Zeros, Oscars, Bettys, and Kates with which it started. It would suffer terribly without the veteran pilots upon which its strategy had depended. As the war moved closer to the home islands, the Japanese would attempt to overcome these inadequacies with what became known to the West as kamikaze tactics.
While Japan and America struggled to win the Battle of Guadalcanal, the forces of General Douglas MacArthur waged war in New Guinea.
General MacArthur was caught out by the Japanese push to take Port Moresby and the rest of New Guinea. That push began on July 22, 1942. The Japanese army was convinced it could not rely on naval support. It decided to conquer the Papuan Peninsula and Port Moresby by the most difficult possible route. The Owen Stanley Mountains combined the extremely difficult terrain with almost impenetrable jungle. General Hyakutake Harukichi directed that 16,000 of the best Japanese troops be landed at Buna. From there, with 1,000 native bearers, they were to push across the Kokoda Trail, which ran 100 crooked miles to Port Moresby. The Japanese brushed back the Australian defending forces. For weeks, they made good progress, but they suffered from lack of food, medical supplies, and the difficult terrain.
Australian resistance, backed by an increasingly powerful ground attack air force, led them down. The Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific had a new leader. Lieutenant General George Churchill Kenney, United States Army Air Forces, had shot down 2 planes in World War I. He was energetic, practical, and a natural leader. In short, he would revolutionize Army air power. Kenney was not only able to stand up to MacArthur, he could also inspire confidence in him. When he arrived at his new command, Kenney found that it was disorganized to the point of fragmentation. Australian, New Zealand, and American crew members were assigned to fly together on a random basis. Attacks were carried out almost informally without precise orders. As a result, only a few aircraft at a time went on raids, and then only in loose formation. Kenney's charter had been to organize existing forces into a competent defense of Australia. He was also to organize a new air force, the 5th, to undertake offensive operations. Kenney ruthlessly shook up his command. He sent home people he considered too tired or insufficiently aggressive. He replaced them with younger men who wanted to fight. Kenny fostered the concept of skip bombing and the use of parafrag bombs. He was infuriated at the low in-commission rate of his most potent weapon, the Boeing B-17. More than half were out for lack of engines or tail wheels alone. He ordered an immediate stand-down on all bomber flying. He started a crash program of maintenance. He wanted 20 B-17s to attack a Japanese air base near Rabaul on August 7, 1942. Only 16 got off. Of these, only 13 made it to the target area. In spite of this attrition, the B-17s managed to make their presence felt. Many Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Kenny had proven that American forces were capable of striking out. The attack reversed a process of defeat that had begun on December 7, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. Kenny gradually obtained air superiority over New Guinea. It was tenuous. The Japanese still had more than 100 aircraft at Rabaul. But the Japanese aircraft rarely intruded over New Guinea. Kenny was able to begin an aerial resupply service to help the land campaign. As Australian and American troops drove the Japanese back, Douglas C-47s ferried in tons of supplies to forward detachments. They also flew the sick and wounded out. And all the while, the intensity of Allied strikes on the Japanese increased. Organized Japanese resistance on the Papuan Peninsula ended on January 22, 1943. The land victory was made possible by the 5th Air Force's dominance.
There is a postscript to this chapter on the Pacific War. In early 1943, Allied codebreakers learned that Admiral Yamamoto was planning an inspection trip. Ironically, this trip would take place exactly 1 year after Jimmy Doolittle's daring raid on Tokyo.
Admiral Yamamoto planned to travel to the Kahili area in South Bougainville. He was famous for his adherence to schedules.
The Allied codebreakers knew his obsession with punctuality. They were able to determine his exact itinerary. He would arrive in a bomber off the southern tip of Bougainville on April 18, 1943. The Army Air Force's P-38s on Guadalcanal had the range to make an interception. Admiral Nimitz gave the authorization for Yamamoto to be assassinated. Major John W. Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, was appointed to lead the attack. "18 P-38 pilots were chosen. An attack section of 4 aircraft, the Killers, would destroy Yamamoto's airplane. The remaining 14 would fight off the escort aircraft. 6 Zeros were known to be accompanying Yamamoto's flight of 2 Bettys. The navigation challenge alone was formidable. The plan called for a 435-mile flight at wave-top level. This would be entirely over the ocean, out of sight of any land-based observers. They were to arrive at a point 35 miles off the coast of Kahili at 0935. P-38 compasses at this time were notoriously unreliable. There were no radio navigation devices. It was also possible that Yamamoto would not arrive on time. If so, the P-38s couldn't wait. It would be a split-second ambush or a wasted effort. The Lockheed P-38 was an extraordinary airplane. It was the first twin-engine, single-seat fighter ever put into mass production. The twin-engine safety and long range of the P-38 made it perfect for the Pacific. After a 2-hour and 42-minute flight over the ocean, the P-38s were still at wave-top height when they saw the Japanese formation, exactly on time and on course. The 2 remaining aircraft of the killer group headed straight for the formation. The protection flight climbed to altitude. Both Bettys were shot down. Yamamoto was killed by gunfire before he crashed into the jungle.
In the wild melee, American pilots claimed 3 Zeros and 3 Bettys shot down. But post-war records show that of Yamamoto's 8-plane formation, only the 2 Bettys were lost. It may be that Zeros were scrambled from Kahili, and these were the victims, but no investigation has confirmed this. One P-38 was lost. Yamamoto's death may well have saved him tremendous loss of face when the full implications of the defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal were evaluated. Instead, his ashes were returned to Japan for a state funeral.